it away.
Thank you, Rabbi Berg, so much for the kind introduction. I'll begin not by talking about the Ottoman Empire, but telling you about something that happened in 2018. In the spring, ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Mea Shearim took to the streets to protest the Israeli government's decision to require an autopsy for a young infant of a Haredi couple who had drowned in a hotel jacuzzi. There was nothing that unusual about these protests. They're one of a string of clashes between the ultra-Orthodox Haredi and the Israeli state, which they consider far too secular. But what made this time different was that a state-run Turkish news agency was on the ground to cover the protests. They interviewed one young Haredi Jew who told them that this never would have happened when Palestine was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. In fact, he went on to tell them that Jews experienced their, quote, best days under the Ottoman Empire, and that the Haredi Jews wanted the Ottomans back. It feels nonsensical to hear an ultra-Orthodox Jew say that he would prefer an Ottoman and a Muslim state in control rather than a Jewish one. It doesn't fit with our current understandings of religion and statehood. But some of you might be familiar with what I would call a mythology about Jewish Ottoman life. That it was an interfaith utopia, that Jews were free to practice their religion, that they did well under the Ottomans, and in the Haredi opinion, better than they do now. The real story is, unsurprisingly, more complicated, but also more fascinating. Many of the Jews in the Ottoman Empire were those who in 1492 were expelled from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella. This is the most famous expulsion. It's one that I think probably all of us are familiar with, but it wasn't the first expulsion from Europe, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. It was part of a larger forced migration between 1100 and 1500. Jews in Europe were expelled from France, from England, from Hungary, Austria, France again, parts of Italy, parts of Germany, Spain, Portugal, and France a few more times. Many of these Jews would eventually find their way to the Ottoman Empire, where they were not only allowed to resettle, they even sometimes were given financial incentives to do so. There's a story that's impossible to verify, that the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in 1492, Bayezid II, told his advisors that Ferdinand, King of Spain, had intentionally impoverished his country by expelling the Jews, but that the Ottoman Empire would benefit from welcoming these same Jews. Through a modern lens, this might look to us like a refugee crisis. An altruistic Ottoman Sultan chooses to open his borders to Jews in need. It wasn't. It was a pragmatic and economic decision. Jews were well educated. They spoke many languages. They had existing successful trading networks to tap into. And at the time, they had no national allegiances or aspirations. To the Ottomans, they looked like the perfect immigrants. And so the Ottomans welcomed them, but only under a certain arrangement. And I think this is best understood not as altruism or generosity on behalf of the Ottomans, but as a contractual relationship where both Jewish refugees and the Ottoman state gave something up but gained something. Jews had to submit to restrictions, and these might sound familiar to us. They couldn't ride horses, only donkeys. Their houses couldn't be any taller than their Muslim neighbors. They couldn't build too many new synagogues or renovate the ones they already had. Sometimes they even had to wear special clothing to indicate that they were Jewish. And most significantly, they paid a head tax per Jew, known as a jizya. It was steep, it was difficult to pay. But in return, they got some things that weren't available to them in most of Europe at the time. Religious freedom, the ability to practice freely, state-assured security, a promise that they wouldn't be subject to forced expulsions, conversions, or other state-sanctioned persecution, and the ability to govern themselves autonomously in several ways. And what is most important here is they got the ability to establish a parallel legal system for themselves. These were Jewish civil courts administered by Jewish judges, enforcing Jewish law for Jewish plaintiffs and defendants. And it was these courts that produced the Responsa. The Responsa are legal documents. In Hebrew, they're called She'olot u'tshuvot, which means questions and answers, and that's just what they were. When a rabbi deciding a case in Jewish court had a question about how to apply a point of law or resolve a conflict, he would write it down and send it to a more eminent rabbi who was more learned in Jewish law. The more important or complicated the question, the farther he might send it. He might send it to a rabbi in Thessaloniki or Istanbul or Palestine, 3 of the large population centers in the empire. That rabbi would consider the question and, drawing on precedent as well as his own opinion and judgment, would write out an answer. These answers would not only apply to the case at hand, they were compiled and distributed, sort of like precedent today. So the writings of these rabbis would influence judges for years to come. So these responsa are obviously answers to specific legal questions, and they can show us a little about that. But they're also a snapshot of Jewish Ottoman life, and they're one of the best snapshots and sources we have about this time. Law is a venue for contesting power, authority, and resources, and these Jewish courts were no different. And so they can show us what issues were at hand, what struggles and tensions existed within the Jewish community, and how rabbis adjusted and responded to these tensions. I want to pause and make clear a point about these parallel legal systems, and it might be helpful at this point if you have the source sheet to look at the diagram. These legal systems were parallel, but they were not autonomous and they were not separate. There's a tendency in writings on Jewish history to treat Jewish communities as separate, as isolated, and as not interacting with the surrounding non-Jewish environment. It's never true, but it's particularly not true in the Ottoman case. These legal borders were porous, and Jews frequently crossed them. For example, they would sometimes take their cases to the state-run Muslim courts if they thought they might get a better deal there. For example, Jewish women seeking divorces often took their cases to Muslim court because Muslim law was generally more favorable to women seeking divorces. Similarly, a contested estate might more benefit a Jew looking to inherit money if he took that case to a Muslim court rather than a Jewish court. Similarly, Jews sometimes brought Muslim witnesses to appear in their own Jewish courts, or they appeared in Muslim courts as witnesses. Also, judges would rely on each other's law. As you can see in this diagram, Muslim judges, in addition to incorporating both Sharia law and Ottoman law and dynastic law, would accommodate minority practices in their decisions. They would sometimes even consult rabbis as to how to make a decision in accordance with both Jewish law and their own law. And Jewish rabbis did the same in making their own decisions. They incorporated not only halakha and their own discretion, but also Ottoman practice, law, in order to accommodate the majority state, which makes perfect sense. As minority Jewish courts operating in a majority Muslim world, they needed to get along. Now, I read dozens of responsa for my senior essay and drew a number of conclusions, but I think it would be a lot more interesting to look at a responsa and see what we can draw from it than have me just tell you. So we'll move now into source 1, a trade fair boycott. To set the stage, this responsa concerns the Jewish communities of Monastir and Belgrade, which would both be in Greece and the Balkans today. These 2 Jewish communities would attend a trade fair nearby. However, on the way to the trade fair, Jewish merchants were often robbed by highwaymen. When they got to the fair, their stalls were often vandalized by other merchants, and the fair stayed open on important Jewish holidays such as Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Tired of the prejudice they were experiencing, these 2 Jewish communities took a vote and decided to boycott the fair. This boycott was binding on all members of these Jewish communities. In fact, if they chose to violate it, they could be sued and penalized in Jewish court. A few years later, some merchants wanted to return to the fair, presumably because they were losing out financially by not attending. However, they were still bound by the boycott, although they hadn't been the original members of the Jewish community that voted on it. They appealed to a rabbi to see if it was still binding that they could not attend the fair. In the rabbi's response, he tells them, yes, as members of the Jewish community, they are still bound by the boycott. However, he suggests that the community reconsider and vote again, as attitudes may have changed and perhaps the community no longer wants to enforce the boycott. So what can we learn from this? First, this dispels the myth of the interfaith utopia. We see obviously that Jews were still subject to prejudice and that life wasn't perfect for them. However, it shows that they had a degree of commercial power. They were commercially successful enough that they thought their boycott might have an impact and might have some change. So this tells us something about their financial success that they found in this region. But what I think is most interesting is what it shows us about Jewish communal administration and autonomy. This is roughly the equivalent of all the Jewish synagogues in Baltimore getting together and deciding to boycott the farmers market under 83. And if you choose to go, they sue you to enforce the penalty. It sounds absurd, but that's what it is. This is not a state, it's just a Jewish community able to enforce these sorts of boycotts and regulations on their members. So it drives home just how autonomous and powerful these Jewish communities were and what they were able to control in part through these legal systems that they'd established. So next we'll move on to a second story, that of the homeowner and tenant. This one's a little complicated, but it's very fun, so bear with me as I explain. There are two characters, Reuven, a landlord, and Shimon, a tenant. Reuven wants to evict Shimon. Under Jewish law, it's incredibly difficult for a landlord to evict a tenant, particularly if he doesn't have a good reason. So Reuven realizes he likely won't have much luck evicting Shimon through the Jewish courts. Instead, Reuven, the landlord, drills a hole above Shimon, his tenant's bed. He pours water in the hole, which then falls on Shimon while he's sleeping. Shimon wakes up, is not too happy, and proceeds to smash most of Reuven's possessions. Not only does he smash them, he smashes them on Shabbat, extra bad. Reuven, his landlord, is furious and decides to call the Ottoman authorities. They come, see that Shimon has destroyed Reuven's possessions, they arrest Shimon, they take him to jail, and they make him pay a very high bail for his freedom. Once free, Shimon decides to sue his landlord, Reuven, in Jewish court. I could go on a whole tangent here about how this responsa shows that good Jews never call the cops on anyone, but I won't. But there's still other lessons we can learn from this. What is most interesting about this to me is the responsa, which was written by a rabbi named Samuel de Medina, who's very famous and a prolific author of responsa. Samuel de Medina lists everyone who messed up in this story. First, Reuven for drilling the hole, then Shimon for destroying the possessions, then Shimon again for destroying possessions on Shabbat. But what he says is most egregious of a violation of Jewish law is not any of these things. It's the fact that Reuven called the Ottoman authorities and turned his tenant over to an Ottoman jail and the Ottoman legal system. In his responsa, Samuel de Medina writes, "It is impossible for us to exonerate him," that's Reuven, "from the greater punishment. As the Rambam wrote, it is forbidden to place a Jew in the hands of the non-Jews, even if he is evil." This is a very typical response of a rabbi to anyone who did something like this, who took a legal dispute to Ottoman court rather than to Jewish court. It's distaste and disgust. Preserving Jewish legal autonomy by penalizing those who undercut it shows how highly valued this autonomy was. And as a rabbi who was a participant in this legal system, Samuel de Medina sees it as his responsibility to punish those who go outside of the bounds of Jewish legal autonomy. These courts are only powerful as long as they are used, and so rabbis had a vested interest in ensuring that Jews stayed within the Jewish legal system and did not cross those porous borders into Muslim courts. Nonetheless, this responsa shows that despite these penalties and this attitude, Jews did just that all the time. Reuven called the Ottoman authorities on Shimon because he knew that he would get what he wanted by doing that, whereas if he had taken him to Jewish court, he likely wouldn't have been as successful. So this really, I think, illustrates this tension between the rabbis who are so invested in protecting this Jewish autonomy and the participants, the Jewish participants in this legal system, who at some points benefited from the legal autonomy, but also very actively worked outside of it to their own benefit. So this now brings us back to where we started with the protest in Mea Shearim, and with the protester who told a Turkish news agency that the Haredi want the Ottomans back, that they enjoyed their best days under the Ottoman Empire. We've seen that it's not an interfaith utopia, although to be clear, the Jewish experience in the Ottoman world was much better than most of Europe at the time. Nonetheless, Jews were still subject to some prejudice and persecution. They were not, to use a modern term, they were second-class citizens in a Muslim majority state. But this Ottoman state is not oppressive, not entirely so, nor intolerant. They allowed and in fact actively protected Jewish community and Jewish legal autonomy. But to answer a broader question, and this is one that as a student of history, it's always important to address, why does it matter what kind of courts Jews had in the 16th century? And it's not an obvious answer. I think it's just interesting, but there is a good reason to study this. What is most fascinating to me is what this tells us both about Jewish communities and about tolerance more broadly. First, we see here that as a Jewish minority in a majority non-Jewish state, Jews had to balance autonomy and integration. Jewish leaders were responsible for that balance and that tension, and it wasn't an easy project. But to speak about what a professor of mine once told us about tolerance, I think this can also be instructive. This professor told me that Christian tolerance, as we understand it, is not what we think of tolerance today. She told my class, you all, speaking to college-age students, think that you are tolerant because you don't care if your friends are gay or Black or Jewish, but that's not tolerance. That's just not caring. Tolerance, to use a Christian sense, is knowing that your neighbor is going to hell and not trying to stop him. And it's this tolerance that was practiced, or more often not practiced, in multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multiracial states in medieval and early modern history. This type of tolerance is still elusive today in these same multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multiracial states, and it was elusive in the Ottoman Empire. But nonetheless, we see that there is an effort to practice this kind of tolerance. These responsa reveal the power of a flexible legal system, one that the rabbis artfully navigated, that shaped and managed social relationships between a Jewish minority and a Muslim state. Put simply, these responsa show us how both the rabbis and the Ottoman state navigated their own definitions of tolerance. They remind us that tolerance requires work, that it is the result of flexibility, accommodation, and pluralism, but that tolerance is possible, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. Thank you very much, and Shabbat Shalom.